Good morning, all. It is a joy and a pleasure to welcome you here to the Mass Chapel of New Brunswick Theological Seminary and to this event that we are so grateful and proud to host with Rutgers University and the Center for Cultural Analysis, an event on race, caste, and Christianity, a conversation that we're very pleased to have and that Colin Yeager will introduce more. I am Nathan Jeremy Brink. I am the Feeks Assistant Professor of the History of Global Christianity here at New Brunswick Theological Seminary. And in part, my great excitement and excitement on the part of the faculty here at New Brunswick Theological Seminary to have this conversation in this space is that we have much work to do and have been doing some of it, to think about the role of our rather old seminary that has played a significant part in Protestant Christian missionary efforts around the world and sometimes explicitly and sometimes implicitly participated in efforts of colonization and cultural imperialism. And so to think about those things and to foster the kinds of partnerships and dialogues where we can do that well is something that is a priority for this faculty. I also am grateful that the president of the seminary, Reverend Dr. Micah McCreary, is here as well to join us in this conversation as well. And with that, I will turn it over to Colin Yeager.
Thanks, Nate. So as Nate said, my name is Colin Yeager. I teach in the English department at Rutgers, and I'm also the director of the Center for Cultural Analysis, just 2 doors down from you all here. So the CCA, if you don't know what we are, we're an interdisciplinary humanities center here at Rutgers. We run research seminars every year, and we have lots of working groups on topics ranging from Marxism to aesthetics to cooperation to urban humanities. And we're excited to be co-sponsoring this event with the seminary. Thanks especially to Nathan and to James Brum of the Reformed Church Center for hosting with us and for providing, among other things, this great space. So this is the first thing that we've, as far as I know, in my institutional memory of Rutgers, this is the first time that CCA has co-sponsored anything with the seminary. I hope it won't be the last. So, what I'll do is I'll introduce our 3 speakers and explain a little bit about the format, and then turn things over to Anderson. So, Anderson Jeremiah is lecturer in world Christianity at Lancaster University in England. He's the author of numerous essays on Dalit theology, post-colonial theology, public theology, among other topics. His research centers on the implications of the shift of Christianity to the global South. Some of his journalism has made him less than popular with the Modi government in India. He's an ordained Anglican priest, and on Twitter, he identifies as an unsystematic theologian. Mukti Mangharam will be the first respondent. She's an associate professor of English at Rutgers. She's my colleague in the English department. Mukti is a scholar of postcolonial and world literature who works comparatively across South Asia, South Africa, and Europe. She's particularly interested in the role of literary form in fostering universal models of personhood. She's the author of Literatures of Liberation, Non-European Universalisms, and Democratic Progress, which came out in 2017. And our second respondent will be Samuel Cruz, who is Associate Professor of Religion and Society at Union Theological Seminary, and also Senior Pastor at Trinity Lutheran Church in Brooklyn. He's the author most recently of a book titled Christianity and Culture in the City, a Post-Colonial Approach, from 2013. And he's just finishing a new book called In God's Image, How U.S. Progressive Christianity Fails in Its Mission for Racial Justice. He's continuing to work on global Pentecostalism and on a book project on Latinas and the LGBT community. Recent journalism includes pieces on LGBTQ civil rights, humane immigration policies, stop and frisk, and the prison industrial complex. So that's the lineup. And our format is that Anderson will speak for about a half hour or so. Mukti and Sam will each respond for about 10 minutes. Then we'll give Anderson a chance to respond quickly to those responses, and then I'll come back up and we'll have a moderated conversation for until about 1:15 or so, when, if all goes well, lunch should be appearing in the room over there, to which you're all welcome to come. So with that, I'll turn things over to Anderson. The title of his talk is Christianity and the Cross-Currents of Race and Caste in South Asia and England, a Post-Colonial Appraisal.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for having me, and I think the conversation part is very exciting for me, and I'm able to share some of my own experiences on also some of the aspects that I've been working on academically. So just to make myself clear, so where do I stand? When I use the term post-colonial, I would like to locate myself and my position as someone who has grown up in India, in South India, and now lives in England and also part of the institutional church. So let me just clarify some of the terms that I will be using and how I will be using. So it's important to acknowledge that colonialism is not only physical but ideological and philosophical, providing a worldview to dominate and rule. And imperialism as the ambition of an empire articulated in government policy papers, trading priorities and defense strategies and, all the whole lot, and particularly sermons for preeminent power and control. Therefore, colonialism occupies not only physical space, but cultural, religious, political, and educational spaces. So it is in this context, decolonization as a process is understood to be a critical element that challenges, and in some cases, ends colonization. And post-colonialism is concerned with developing perspectives from the point of emancipation from the subjugation of colonial and imperial powers. And it's also wary of neo-colonialism, which strives to extend imperialism and colonialism, but with a local flavor. So often, neo-colonialism assumes power by reactivating entrenched structures of discrimination and prejudice, such as race and caste, legitimized by Christianity. And that's what I will be focusing on for the next half hour or so. When I use post-colonial work, I predominantly use, of course, the pantheons of post-colonial work like Edward Said and Fanon and others, but also most recently people like R.S. Sugidraja within the Christian context of Kwak Poilon and others. So let me talk about the first aspect, race and colonialism. So I go with one of the definitions given by Himani Banerjee, who works on similar topic. She talks about race as the social phenomenon I refer to as race is not a biological distinction that inheres in people themselves. It is a power-inscribed way of reading or establishing difference and finding a long-lasting means for reproducing such readings, organization, and practice. Although academically race is described as a category of people who share inherited physical characteristics and whom others see as being distinctive group, I'm inclined to argue along with Banerjee that it is far from the fact. Racial stratification is built on the premise that social differences are linked with hereditary characteristics which differ between races. Historically, a race is a social construct, is a group of people who share similar and distinct physical characteristics, and the kind of common language and usage was not prevalent until 17th century as race, more explicitly used by Walter Scott, for example, in his writings to distinguish between Normans and Saxons. So it is important to keep in mind how these classifications of humanity through categories such as race was birthed in Europe and subsequently disseminated throughout the New World and pronounced divisions of humankind on the basis of species, tribe, or nations of people. Sureshi, a Sri Lankan scholar, comments on this as Europe embarked, I quote, on the conquering trail around the world, while meeting new people and land, it is argued that they collectively renamed, remapped, and reordered into intentional hierarchy of races, colors, religions, and cultures. Moreover, colonial taxonomies linked racialized bodies with racialized territories, cultures, and practices, making associational links with white and non-white bodies and related practices. European discourse of race were hegemonic in their universal application, while both colonizer and the colonized were classified under 19th century taxonomies of race. Even those inauspiciously categorized were generally convinced of its validity and relevance and embraced these new ideas. And of course, from a materialistic perspective, Marx recognized that racism is the phenomenon of exploitation of people in a capitalist society. Marx argues that race serves as a convenient tool of capitalism, the divide and rule policy of colonialism, and the centrality of slavery in its expansion across the world. In this context, race as an expression is used to designate the inferior status of slaves from that of their masters. For instance, African race would have clearly sent the message of black inferiority, argues David Olusoga in his book Black and British. Anthropologically, an ethnic group is a socially distinct population that shares common language, culture, and way of life. These groups are committed to the ideas, norms, and material things that constitute a way of life. They can be identified through ethnic traits and the whole range of characteristics that emerge from that expression. Race and ethnicity are often confused and used interchangeably due to the concept of minority groups. Looking through colonial history, it is apparently clear that race-based ethnography deeply shaped the intricate groupings of caste system, for example. If we look at the national census in 19th century, caste as defined by the Brahminical order was central in categorizing people. However, as Michael Banton recently articulated, the difficulty of defining race and ethnicity without historical locatedness, we should be careful not to offer a normative definitions of either race or ethnicity, but develop a practical knowledge of these notions as they are lived and experienced, both historically and in present times, and in order to address its relevance for our discussion. As the history teaches us, it is hard to isolate colonial practice from the social norms of England in the Middle Ages. In other words, much of the colonial attitudes, British colonial attitudes toward other cultures and peoples, were deeply embedded in the British social worldview. Moreover, some would argue that it is the perspective that gave rise to colonial enterprise, to conquer and civilize the heathen cultures and bring them to the fold of Christianity. In all these developments, the church was intensely involved in legitimizing such adventures. England was a fertile ground to absorb racial prejudices and stereotypes into its own pre-existing class-ridden society. And if you read a wonderful book by Catherine Hall, she writes Missionary Stories, Gender and Ethnicity in England in the 1830s and 1840s, white, male, and middle class. The hierarchical social organization of landlords, gentry, and the poor, landless laborers was an accepted social norm and religiously rightfully practiced. The foremost identity in England in the 16th century was Christian identity, and more precisely the church and the chapel they attended classified their social status. It was not only class indicator, but also a signifier of their human nature. It was difficult for racial prejudices and discrimination to map on to the moral landscape. Christianity, as practiced by people in England, across the board accepted the racial inferiority of non-white, and the need for them to be treated as such permeated every aspect of the society. And here is one of the most important figurehead of that change, Dr. David Livingstone. In the 1800s, he explored the African interior under the motto, Christianity, Commerce, and Civilization. If slavery was the backbone of British colonialism, Christianity was the moral compass. Moussa Dubé speaks of Livingstone as a good example of divinely commissioned genius in colonizing Africans and a shining example of a missionary who openly championed colonial domination in sub-Saharan Africa, especially through his declaration that civilization, Christianity, and commerce should always be inseparable. She argues that Livingstone, of having capitalized on a rampant human trade in the interior of Africa to appeal to his compatriots to colonize Africa, she also points out that Livingstone successfully stimulated the interest of traders, geographic societies, and missionary societies, that is, various colonial agents, to open Western commerce, civilization, and Christianity to occupy and civilize Africans. There is also a popular story about the Bible, as Dubé argues that when the white man came to our country, he had the Bible and we had the land. The white man said to us, "Let us pray." After the prayer, the white man had the land and we had the Bible. Dubé explains that this is how Africans connect colonialism to Bible. And this has very important ramifications of how Christianity was practiced and understood and lived in England. And it's very important to quote Andrew Walls. He notes that the missionary pioneer was spoken of in the vocabulary of the imperial pioneer. Sometimes missionary occupations preceded annexation or political penetration, and sometimes it followed, as in Uganda, Nyasa land, and Bakun land. It was intimately associated with the establishment of British rule, unquote. During the height of colonial activities, the churches and clergy in England also benefited from slave trade. More specifically, many of the clergy owned slaves, and some of the biggest cathedrals were built by generous donations from slave masters. While Victorian England was enjoying the benefits of slavery, the missionaries were also working tirelessly to convert the heathens and civilize them by bringing religion to them. As I will expand later about the mission work in the Indian subcontinent, very little was done on their part to challenge some of the worst atrocities taking place in the colonies. And I, for one, know that in the Indian context, for example, the Magnificat, which is very important within the Anglican liturgy, was not allowed to be said due to the fear that it might trigger a revolt against the colonial establishment. What was happening in the colonies in terms of Christian mission and anti-slavery movements did make an impact on the host country, but as Ruth Watts captures that, anti-slavery and missionary activities could arouse humanitarian sympathies and sentiments of brotherhood and sisterhood, but this generally was within a framework of acceptance of the superiority of white people, their civilization and religion. In other words, life in England during the colonial period continued as it was before, reinforcing class and racial bias within the church and beyond. So the Church of England, as the established church, is embedded in this historical legacy, and it is no surprise that such racial prejudices are deeply entrenched and manifest itself in current structures. Let me move to the next aspect. Caste. The caste system forms the distinct backbone of Hindu social order. As such, a significant presence across the South Asian society. The social structure and ideology of the caste system is possible combination of Varna system and Jati, birth divisions, further underpinned by notions of purity and pollution. The social and religious cultural practice continues to have stronghold in the South Asian society. But very important to keep in mind, and of course you can see the fourfold division and also the fifth category who are untouchables and outcasts. Even in parts of Ceylon and Sri Lanka and other parts of Pakistan and Bangladesh, the same practice continued, but in different forms. But it's important to keep in mind that the term caste itself is not Indian. It's a Portuguese word in origin, derived from Latin word castus. So it was only when Portuguese colonial powers came that they needed to introduce a categorization to capture all the different social categorizations that were happening within the Indian subcontinent. Therefore, what happened was that there was this colonial anthropology that was being mapped onto how social categorization was happening within Indian context. Therefore, they begin to use caste as a category, and then it takes a life of its own. And most importantly, it was the British colonial rule that kind of institutionalized the caste system as the main mechanism through which people in India could be categorized and scheduled. And they did it very, very efficiently because there were several censuses that took place between 1815 and to early 1900. So several censuses, they all used the same anthropological mechanism that was used to categorize people. And the most important thing is that the difference for the British colonial process was that because they used the same kind of racialized process that was happening back in England, which was being used in Africa, so they used the same system into articulating how this anthropological mapping of Indian society could be worked out. And of course, there were other leaders like Jyotirao Phule and Ambedkar who wanted to come up with a different identity for the outcasts and the untouchables. Therefore, they begin to articulate a new vocabulary, which is called the Dalit people. Now, Christian mission in South Asia is a very complex process. Of course, there is a sense that Christianity came to Indian subcontinent in the 16th century, but unfortunately there has been Christians there from the 1st century. Whether St. Thomas went there or not, but there was a very vibrant community that was very much present. And the Catholic missionaries were the first ones to arrive, and they accompanied the Portuguese colonial powers. And of course, what they did is that instead of getting embroiled in the conflict, they rather adapted a safer method, not to have a confrontational attitude to the caste system, keeping in line with the official colonial policy. The missionaries adapted an accommodative evangelization approach, which did not threaten or undermine the caste system. The Protestant colonial powers, followed by their missionaries, arrived in the 17th century, but by then the Catholic Church had made progress in terms of getting their church established, as well as caste being introduced within their church structures. The Dutch had a large presence in Sri Lanka, South India, and parts of what would be later called Indonesia and Taiwan. In order to promote their Reformed Christian tradition, they sent more than 254 preachers and about 800 lower-ranked church employees, along with the company officials, across their territories. So the Dutch East India Company's charter in 1642 clearly stated that only the Reformed Christian religion could be practiced in its territories, and that it should follow the company rule of non-interference, with harsh punishment for non-compliance, clearly demonstrating the nexus between the colonial powers and the mission organization. The British East India Company followed the same pattern as the Dutch East India Company from the time they arrived in Madras and Bombay. Initially, the British East India Company did not allow any missionary activities within its territories and resisted various efforts by the missionary organization to allow their presence. Only chaplains were allowed to minister to the employees of the East India Company. After hearing about the plans of an evangelical mission organization to missionaries to India, one of the directors of the English East India Company commented that it was the most wild, extravagant, expensive, and unjustifiable project that ever was suggested by the most visionary speculator. Despite this hostility, English mission organizations continued their efforts, but they couldn't convince the British authorities to accept this process, so they actually paid some Germans to be sent via the Danish settlement in Tranquebar. So the first Protestant missionary to arrive in 1706 was a German working in a Danish settlement, but working for an Anglican mission organization. So there's a sense of how vicariously they worked for Anglican mission work. But after that, London Missionary Society, Church Missionary Society, and Scottish Missionary Society, they all followed suit. But the relationship between the missionaries and the local colonial rulers, as Anna Johnston writes, the relationship between missionaries and the colonial state was one fraught with complications, ambiguity, and extreme provisionality. In different mission fields of the British Empire, this relationship was variously mutually supportive, mutually antagonistic, or ambivalent. In short, it was highly contingent on local circumstances. But of course, the non-interference policy was very much on the table. A memo from London Missionary Society Board of Directors instructs missionaries must be sure of manifesting in their own conduct and promoting also in others a sincere and affectionate respect to the government and to the subordinate authorities which it appoints. Missionaries had clear instructions from their colonial masters not to meddle with the Indian society at large. As observed earlier, interference of any kind or violation of East India Company rules would result in immediate termination of relationship with mission organization. Although many missionaries considered caste within the church was an unmitigated evil, but ultimately yielded to the pressure of accommodating such prejudices. Famously, in 1833, Bishop Wilson of Calcutta urged that the distinction of caste must be abandoned decidedly, immediately, finally. But however, Bishop Reginald Heber, a pioneer Anglican bishop who was slightly higher than Bishop Wilson, supported the segregated worship practice on the lines of caste and compared it to the situation in America and Europe, where Christian masters and slaves worshipped in different places, upholding the racial segregation policies of the company. From these observations, it is obvious that by accommodating caste practices, they colluded with the colonial authorities in legitimizing it. Unlike the class struggle that manifested itself in the doctrinal and denominational divisions in Europe, the fertile mission fields of South India provide a different role for the denominational identity. Although some of the missionary societies were interdenominational, many of them were deeply denominational in their identity. So in 1910, in order to avoid kind of sheep stealing among different mission organizations, in 1910, when the missionary organizations gathered in Edinburgh, they all had a gentleman's agreement that they will stick to their own geographical territories. And the result is that many of these organizations began to work with specific caste communities. Therefore, what happened later in 1900 and in the run-up to the formation of various churches, many of these denominations developed their own caste identity. So, for instance, if you're a Scottish Reformed church, you had a specific caste. If you're an Anglican, you had a specific caste. And if you're belonging to London Missionary Society, you belong to a different caste. So very interestingly, denominational identities became caste identities, a de facto caste identity in the Indian context. And this kind of could be found right across the Indian subcontinent. So now, it's very important that how the people in this part of the world were kind of portrayed in order to generate sympathies back home when colonial power, particularly in India, when the British East India Company was facing difficulty in the later part of 19th century and early part of 19th century, they began to send images like this one to generate support so that we need to carry on our work. And how they were portrayed in that process. Now, moving on, soon after the Brexit vote in 2016 in England, news began to emerge that there was a huge scandal, that the British government was trying to silence some important issue. Windrush scandal that rocked the British society and political establishment last 2 years strangely provides a bridge to connect the past with the present. After the Second World War, Britain was reeling under the effects of war and needed a manpower to rebuild its infrastructure and social services. To compensate the labor shortage, Britain invited people from the Caribbean countries such as Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, and Barbados, all members of the British Empire, and were eligible to have citizenship in Britain. Many immigrants arrived in Britain, especially the first ship named MV Empire Windrush, carrying 500 Jamaicans, arrived in Britain in 1948. Thus, the generation that followed this process were known as Windrush generation. Most of the immigrants from Commonwealth were given indefinite leave to remain. Through 1971 Immigration Act gave Commonwealth citizens. However, a scandal broke in 2017 that many children of these families and others were either forcibly sent back home or told that they are staying in UK illegally. This is the second generation of people. Why this story is important for understanding race relations in Britain today is that it captures the attitude of British political class that was able to use and exploit people for its own survival and dispose them when they are no longer needed. This is nothing new, because this is what happened during the colonial period. Instrumentalization of dehumanized communities. The erstwhile colonies will testify to this fact. However, this Windrush generation is hugely important for understanding the racial tensions in Britain today. Whenever there is a large-scale immigration of people, it certainly has an immediate effect on the host society. In the case of Windrush generation, the sudden influx of Caribbean black men and women occupying social space in Britain flared up racial tensions never seen before. As explained earlier, British society in the 16th and 19th century, class and racial identity is crucial, and people were treated accordingly. It was the case even within the church, and Christianity as a religion conveniently embraced class and racial identity. But the Windrush generation posed a different problem. Many of the Christians who came during this period couldn't find a place in the established church because they were all mostly Anglicans back in Caribbean islands, were told to go away in some cases, and in some cases racially abused. Several Christians began to set up their own churches, ending up in the proliferation of a Pentecostal and charismatic churches of Caribbean heritage. This development within the Christian landscape not only points to the lack of hospitality from mainstream institutional churches towards Caribbean and other ethnic minority Christians, it also explicitly suggests the continuation of racial prejudices within the churches in England. More broadly, within Church of England, even after centuries of foreign mission work in the erstwhile colonies, coupled with growing number of immigrants to Britain, the presence and representation of black and Asian minority ethnic Christians are awfully short. Just last week, the Archbishop of York made a statement. Archbishop of York is the second most senior person in Church of England. He's the Archbishop of York, and he himself is an immigrant, and he's one of 4 bishops of minority ethnic heritage out of 135. So he said that there is deep-seated racism within the Church of England. If you view this statement in conjunction with the growing rate of race-based hate crimes in England, potentially dangerous image emerges. What these brief observations suggest is that England still hasn't come to terms with racial diversity and has not changed its latent racial prejudices manifested during the empire or through the colonial mission period. And of course, I just wanted to put that hymn. Probably many of you know that hymn. It's from one of the favorite Anglican hymns. It's called All Things Bright and Beautiful. And the verse goes like, "The rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate, God made them high or lowly and ordered their estate." And it was the way it is even sung today in some churches. And sometimes when I'm leading the services, I had to say, we will omit that verse. Probably even God doesn't agree with that. Further, the continuation fragmented nature of British society due to social inequality and racial prejudices was given substantial space due to the ongoing Brexit saga. And Brexit has really brought out clear divisions among the British society. Most recently, one of the research projects that I'm beginning to work with is how Christianity has become a white religion, where English Defence League and Britain First groups like very far-right groups are using like St. George's Cross and the Crusade symbols to reclaim Christianity, which is increasingly becoming colored. So this is the expression that's being used within England. Caste, on the other hand, continues to play a vital role in shaping Christian experience in South Asia. In spite of the rapid changes overtaking South Asian social cultural landscape, be it economic advancement or technological revolution, the Christian communities in many cases still continue to suffer. Here are two images, and one on the top left is a collection of images of manual scavenging. And if you haven't heard, in many parts of India, human beings still carry, maybe I can swear in this place, people still carry other people's shit. And here is a set of images where these people are carrying. And this is their caste duty. And many of these people are Christians. And so they are, on Sundays, sit in churches and sing hymns and do all the good things. On Monday morning, they have to go and clean up the shit, someone else's shit. So that's the same state of caste problem in the Indian society. And also, the other image, which I took some time back, is a cemetery, where you can see a wall running right through the cemetery, where Dalits are buried in one area, and non-Dalits are buried in another area. So even in the cemetery, they are separated. This is the recent situation. And so is the case across churches. In many parts of South India, there are two worship places, especially within those who consider themselves high caste, do not take common communion with other communities within the communities of, they might be living in the same place. Particularly, there are churches within the Marthoma tradition where some are Syrian background and some are of Dalit background. They cannot be sharing the common cup. And I've had personal experience where I've been told as a priest of the Church of South India not to come into certain churches because of my own Dalit background. So caste is a very live issue within the Indian church. And interestingly, it also spreads, this is the practice of South Asians, that they just don't keep their caste back home, but they also carry it wherever they go. And there was a recent report, Caste in Britain, which did a particular survey that how Indian communities, Indian diaspora in UK continue to practice caste-based discrimination. And even to the extent of having kind of domestic people who are from the low caste community who are employed. So, and it's very important to keep in mind that this is the continuation of this situation. So to conclude, by way of conclusion, let me return to my positionality as a post-colonial subject who endured caste discrimination and now embedded in an institutional church that was and is part of the colonial fabric. These two realms of prejudice converge, reminding ourselves that colonization is a process of ideological, philosophical, and spatial domination that permeates into every aspect of human life. Post-colonialism is concerned with developing perspectives from the point of emancipation from the subjugation of colonial and imperial powers. It is also wary, as I mentioned, that we need to be aware of the neo-colonial processes that assumes power by reactivating entrenched structures of discrimination and prejudice. It is in this context we need to situate my analysis of race and caste within Christianity, particularly the colonial mission. With my previous observations, Christianity and Christian mission that accompanied colonial expansion became a tool of imperialism despite its positive contributions. As explained earlier, Christian mission activities in several occasions by accommodating a racialized worldview colluded in colonial expansion. Let me suggest 4 different points of convergence between race and caste. That could be a good point of our conversation. What post-colonial perspective that I would like to offer is that under colonialism, race and caste were instrumentalized to offer a worldview of graded humanity. And also it became a mechanism of dehumanization, alienation from resources, from their culture, and also from their own communities. And also it became a mechanism of subordination and domination. Finally, it also became a tool to institutionalize prejudice within the church, both in England and in South Asia. So what we have observed through British Empire is that they were able to use both race and caste categories to subjugate and exploit vast communities through slavery and colonization. And it is in this context, they have left a lasting legacy in both contexts and continue to impact the lives of millions of Christians. So it is paramount that through post-colonial inquiry, we may be able to challenge and deconstruct neo-colonial tendencies that tends to reactivate entrenched structures of discrimination and decolonize Christianity and the church. And if we let ourselves be stuck in a nostalgic understanding of the past, we will be missing the point, because that's how colonialism reignites itself and becomes new forms of prejudices and discrimination. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that fascinating talk. I learned so much. It was so interesting. So I'll just talk through some of my own responses, which come from my own particular position within a literature department as well. I found your talk particularly illuminating when you spoke about the way that Christianity mapped onto existing social hierarchies in the colonial period instead of alleviating them. That missionaries entrenched caste divisions along denominational lines, on top of which sat the ultimate racial hierarchy of the colonizers versus the colonized. And one question that I was hoping that you would speak more about, maybe in the discussion portion of our session today, is about what happens to these divisions in the post-colonial period. You talked a lot about how neocolonialism thrives on reinvigorating these older divisions. And on the question of race, you're quite clear. Racial divisions between previously colonized subjects and colonizers persist in the Anglican Church in Britain today, and the Windrush generation you talked about were and continue to be victims of that. But what about caste? So within the Anglican Church, how do caste divisions manifest themselves? Do they remain elements of the intra-relationships between South Asians? Or are they acknowledged by the churches they belong to in particular ways? Are denominational differences still mapped onto caste lines? What bodily practices persist? These are genuine questions of curiosity from somebody who doesn't know anything about this. And I think to answer these questions properly, we would need to turn to ethnography in a way. But since I deal with social questions through literature, I'm wondering if we can also approach these and other questions through the novel and not just through ethnography. And two novels came to mind as I was listening to you talk. One is not so well known because it's more recent. It's called The Space Between Us by a writer called Thriti Umrigar, who actually lives in the US. And it maps the relationship between a domestic servant called Bhima in urban India and her female employer Sarabhai. And in this novel, it's very interesting that caste divisions manifest themselves as class divisions. So practices that we've associated with caste hierarchies, such as notions of bodily pollution, the use of separate utensils, the division of private space, are never mentioned explicitly as functions of religion or in terms of caste identity. Rather, they're always justified by Sarabhai, the employer, in the language of class. She talks about the dirt and the disease that the domestic servant supposedly brings with her into the private space of Sarabhai's home from the slum in which she lives. I mentioned this to ask whether in post-colonial urban India and in Britain, you would say that caste manifests itself more generally as class. Is this something that you've come across in your own work and in your own research? And this is also just another way of asking whether and how caste has changed in the contemporary global capitalist movement. A lot of a lot of I know that a lot of Dalit struggles for liberation in contemporary India take on Marxist forms. So that's another angle at which I'm coming from when I ask that question. The other novel that I'm thinking of is much more famous, The God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy. And in that novel, caste divisions are portrayed as the wheel upon which the novel's tragic plot unfolds. The prejudices held by an upper caste Syrian Christian family towards its untouchable employee result in tragedy not just for the employee Velutha, but also ultimately it leads to the unraveling of the entire upper caste family as well. It results in Velutha's death, but also ultimately Ammu's death, who is the upper caste woman who loves and sleeps with him. The tragedy of caste in that novel, in other words, is very much a shared one, and it ripples through the generations. So my related question is about the difficulty then of maintaining caste division. And that might seem like a silly thing to say, but I'll just explain where I'm coming from. While it's easily understood, as you have shown as well, that caste is rational in that it is a tool of power hierarchies, it's instrumental, it keeps those with power in power. I'm wondering whether it's also profoundly irrational even from the perspective of the oppressor, whether in the longer scheme of things, such as that which unfolds in the novel through a focus on one family's tragedy, maintaining caste ends up hurting the group who holds the power. This is something also portrayed in the space between us, because the employer's ultimate refusal to recognize her domestic servant's humanity comes at a profound personal cost to her. So let me just transfer this literary analysis back to the historical and social. What changes, I'm asking, in the way we think about caste if we see it as a shared burden, not just for Dalits, but for upper caste women or for those otherwise upper caste subjects who, like Ammu and Sarabhai, bear the burden of other intersectional oppressions like patriarchy? In the space of the public sphere in Britain, how does caste end up undermining larger solidarities, such as ones that racial solidarity has historically challenged? And I'm thinking here about a moment in Britain in the, I believe it was the 1970s and 1980s, where women from South Asia, the Caribbean, and Africa united with each other over and above interracial hierarchies to challenge white supremacy together. And you guys might have heard about something called the Southall Black Sisters, where everybody in that group was black, even though they were from different parts of the post-colonial world and had various skin tones. So if we transfer that example back to caste, has caste within British South Asian communities been undermined in the face of a racially white, majoritarian, often hostile society? And it's a hopeful question. Have groups from different castes come together in that way, in an act of solidarity, in order to take on what seems to be a much larger challenge in terms of the scale of it, which is living in post-colonial Britain in a white, majoritarian, often hostile society? So those are just some, very dispersed thoughts, but they all come from what was a very rich and fascinating discussion that you began with, and I'm so grateful for that, and I hope that we can talk further.
I don't know if I have questions, or they might be questions without really looking like questions. When I was reading your paper, I thought of what I often tell my students to read, but I don't want to know what they disagree with or agree with. I want to know what's fertile in what they're reading for their own research. So I guess to some extent my response is it's about what I found fertile for my own research and work and interest in this topic. Professor Jeremiah starts his presentation by stating two of several of his objectives. The close nexus between colonial institutions and Christian mission in perpetuating some of these notions, and to analyze its continuing legacy, its impact on the livelihoods of people in South Asia and England. I would include, for my purposes, the United States. In particular, my interest lies in the second piece, analyzing the continuing legacy, how it manifests itself and how it survives in white liberal progressive Christianity and its perpetuation of white supremacy. Quite often, scholars of religion or theology in this country focus on right-wing Christianity, overlooking how white liberal progressive Christianity perpetuates white supremacy. These are the thoughts that came to my mind. The powerful impact of religion, especially Christianity, on the colonial process of the Americas has not been widely addressed. For example, in 1898, several months prior to the invasion of Puerto Rico by the United States, 7 Christian denominations from the U.S. met in New York City to discuss how they would help in the process of evangelization and Americanization of the Puerto Rican people. I have to say that in this process, if you read the history, you hear all the descriptions by the missionaries of the Puerto Rican people, calling them lazy, dumb, and immoral, among many things. There was practically no differentiation between evangelization and Americanization. The churches and the military worked hand in hand in this colonial process, which is very interesting to see how that process took place all over the place, but with distinct characteristics. Despite the central role in the apparatus of racist ideology, despite the central role of religion, in this case I'm thinking of Christianity in the apparatus of racist ideology and oppression, its role has not been adequately investigated. Religious studies scholar J. Cameron Carter stated, "Yet," and I quote, "yet one is hard-pressed to find an adequate theological account of the problem of race. This is all the more surprising given that modern racial discourse and practice have their genesis inside Christian theological discourse and missiological practice, which themselves were tied to the practice of empire in the advance of Western civilization." In the United States, there's a resurgence of racial discourses within Christian denominations, organizations, and Christian institutions of higher learning, trying to respond to this growing crisis of white supremacy. Euro-American Christianity, with its dismal legacy of racial justice, is in a frenzy to make up for its deplorable history. I recently read about Princeton Theological Seminary designating $27 million for reparations. The Episcopal Church in America, throughout many of its dioceses, such as the Diocese of New York, are having discussions on reparations, which include anti-racist training programs. If I have a question in terms of how this process functions and how subtle it is, I have to say that I am suspicious of anti-racist training programs. In fact, it's hard to find one major Christian denomination that is not involved in some form of anti-racism training. What I would ask, or I do ask, and I don't fully understand, is how do you train people not to accept the murder of black and brown people in the streets of the United States? What kind of training, how do you train people to that? So I'm somewhat suspicious that if these anti-racist training programs are really meant to do what they're doing, or is it just a way of assuaging people's guilt? I would suggest that religion is still one of the most powerful mechanisms of legitimation of racial and other discourses in our society. It should not be ignored that Sunday mornings is still the most segregated time in our country. I repeat again, a lot of interest on how these colonial ideologies on race and caste have continued to extend imperialism, in your words, and colonialism with a local flavor. The subtle ways that white supremacy manifests itself is really of, I think, importance to me. So I want to share, I've been doing some work for my book project, so I want to share an interview that I had with the Reverend Dr. Serene Jones, who's the president of Union Theological Seminary. My first question to Dr. Jones was, have you witnessed racism or the denial of racism here at Union? She responded that she had not experienced anything that would be an item to be featured in the New York Times, and that Union and its faculty and staff are dedicated to ending racism. However, she said one would have to be ignorant to assume that racism is not very much alive in all institutions. Most liberal progressives that I have encountered, she said, in actuality do suffer from that ignorance because the denial of racism by them is rampant. Further into the interview, she said, liberals and progressives are so self-righteous that they would be insulted at the suggestions that they might be racist. I would add that the most damaging aspect of liberal progressive notions of racism is its denial. Dr. Jones went on to say that although she has not witnessed shocking behavior, what has been more devastating are the structural realities that maintain the white supremacist ideology. She explained that she has witnessed and also assumes that white supremacy manifests itself in how students are graded, as well as in the interactions that take place in class, i.e. social cues that affect how we view people, how academic assessment and achievements are analyzed. I said it is a very scary proposition to accept because literally people's futures might be dependent upon the decisions of individuals who are unconsciously operating under racist assumptions. I pointed out to Dr. Jones that Union faculty is much more diverse than other institutions, and she agreed. But she also emphasized that the board of directors, the highest level of governance, needs to be much more diverse. She said that hopefully 50% of the board will be women. There are 4 or 5 blacks on the board and only one Latinx person who is the vice chair and acting chair. I asked why the Latinx presence at Union was almost non-existent. Not only are Latinx students virtually absent in the school, but very few of the staff other than maintenance personnel. Interestingly, Dr. Jones commented that the recruitment of Latinx students has been one of her priorities since she arrived at Union 12 years ago. She added that this new incoming class would have a larger Latinx student body. After my interview with Dr. Jones, I requested the admissions office to provide me with the number of incoming Latinx students, and their response was a total of 4. To my surprise, Dr. Jones said that if a school is truly committed to Latinx recruitment, it needs to take actionable financial and strategic action to implement its aspirations. I say surprisingly because in my 12 years of Union, I have witnessed no strategic, financial, or other organizational support for Latinx recruitment. All efforts to address the Latinx students in the school have been ignored despite statements to the contrary by the administration. I bring this up because liberal progressive Christians and in secular institutions love to talk quite a bit about this stuff as if that talk results in changing the situation. I told Dr. Jones that I recall when I began teaching at Union Theological Seminary in 2008 that I was astonished and troubled to hear students comment to me that they had no idea there was such a thing as U.S. Latinx theology. How could it be that in arguably the most liberal, progressive, and radical seminary in the world, the theologies of non-Europeans would be invisible? I said it seemed to me that Union Theological Seminary moved from a once white male-dominant theological curriculum to an interreligious curriculum while skipping over Black and Latinx theological curriculums. In addition, I said interreligious curriculum is a white-led curriculum, even if Buddhism and Islam are being taught. How could it be that a student at Union Theological Seminary be there for 3 years and never have heard of U.S. Latinx theology? Or how can it be that you can graduate from Union and never take one course on Black Christianity or Latinx Christianity? So I guess what I'm saying here is the subtle way in which the white apparatus continues to maintain control even when appearing to be liberal and progressive. Oh, we're studying Islam now, we're studying Buddhism, but we forget everything else in the side, and including they continue to control how Islam and Buddhism is taught. To the second part of the question, Dr. Jones says she had no idea that could be the case. She also said she agreed about the invisibility of Latinx theology. She spoke.
1 minute, Sam. 1 or 2 more minutes.
Okay. She spoke of the oppression of invisibility. Dr. Jones also mentioned the fact that Neva said nothing about Latinx people while speaking about African Americans, although in many instances in racist ways. Neva is like the guru of social justice, liberal ethics within Protestant Christianity. But to end, I want to talk a little bit about the curriculum, especially there's a whole movement to do interreligious engagement while in forgetting, which is part of the history of this country in terms of racial ideology, forgetting the people that are right around you. So at Union, we have a whole program of study of Islam and Buddhism, 2 different tracks that you could take. But mention of Black Islam is never done when the majority of Muslims in this country are African American. And we're in Harlem, 4 blocks away from where Malcolm X spoke and other great leaders within the Islamic tradition. And the individuals who run these programs happen to be Euro-American, which is very interesting to me. But in addition, I just want to state one experience that I had, which was when I went to Union actually to do my lecture for my position. I was speaking about Haitian voodoo. And Paul Knitter, I don't know if any of you have heard of him, he wrote the book, Without Buddhism, I Could Not Be a Christian, who's like the guru of interreligious engagement, asked me a really interesting question. He said, do you deal with the issue of evil and voodoo? And I mentioned this because I've spoken to him and I said that I will speak about this. I wouldn't do it without having had a discussion with him. And I said, no, because it's so small compared to the evil in Christianity that it's not worth talking about. The issue is that I recently spoke to him so that I could write about it in my book with his consent and discuss it. And he was able to acknowledge that he was operating under those popular notions that voodoo has to do with little dolls that you stick needles into to have people die or be poisoned. And he was able to acknowledge that we still come at things from our locations. So the point I'm trying to make is that interreligious engagement or interfaith dialogue, whichever way you want to call it, is still quite often dominated by white, ideological, colonial, oppressive perspectives, although people don't see that. And people don't even ask the questions, why are we also, Union has a whole interreligious engagement program. If it wasn't for the fact that I decided to teach African religions in the Americas, nobody would be talking about African religions, because it's the white educational system that determines what is worthy to be studied and what is not to be studied. So the same white supremacist ideas are infiltrated in a system that appears to be open In fact, I say this with a lot of trepidation, but I even asked the question, why is Buddhism such a fad in our country right now? Who determined that? How is it that come to be? And I wonder if there's a correlation between the notion of the myth of Asian immigrants being the model minority, which is a myth, and looking at Buddhism as a way of being the model religion that we should be studying.
Up, I think Jane.
No, the chairs are coming.
Oh, the chairs are coming to here. Okay. All right. Then you can come up. Ah. Excellent. Anderson, we can put you in the middle. Yeah, you got to sit in the middle. You got to sit in the middle. So, Anderson, do you want to say anything quickly in response? There's a lot on the table at this point, so pick a couple things if you'd like. Otherwise, we can just go right to it.
Quickly, I think you, to respond to Mukti's one of the questions, how caste kind of adapts itself to the contemporary context. I think one of the key aspects of caste system and how it is able to survive these kind of 3,000 years of history is that its adaptability and how it can adapt to new circumstances and how it manifests itself in different ways. One of the ways that caste has found meaning and purpose in a new globalized economy is that the same caste hierarchy was adapted by the economic system, wherefore the landlords who had land become the agents of the globalized economy, wherefore still the same laborers who were not employed have become still the same situation. So there is a very interesting way how it's been adapted. And particularly speaking from an urban spaces, it's very interesting that people do operate in different ways. But if you look at, for example, the Wipro, one of the biggest Indian software company, if you go to their center, it's very high spec. It's like kind of Google and Facebook area. But then you drill down who are employed there, mostly 80% either from either a Brahmin caste or from a Kshatriya caste. So they are the ones who make it into those systems. So what's happening is that there is a very tacit way of being, even the modernized global economies, adapting the use of caste system for its own purposes. And again, all these highly educated Dalit communities and young men and women still are part of the biggest unemployed sector in India. And there are several men and women who are still going back to become agriculture laborers and things like that. So there are several stories. But the thing is that caste was able to, because caste is multi-layered in meaning. So different groups of people can appropriate and use it for their own purposes. So that's the nature of caste system as a porous category, is infused with meaning by the people who use it, dominate and exclude people. And the second thing is that, of course, I think the question of shared burden, I think that's a very important thing. You very rightly pointed out that how patriarchy comes into play. And most recently, I've been following this work of one of the authors, Sureshi. She has been writing about how Indians are targeting other African communities who live in India in the same way, in the same racist attack that's been happening for a long time. What's happening is that what she calls is a category called racialized casteism. So they are practicing the same caste practice, but with a racialized understanding that somehow Indians are superior than the Africans. So it's fascinating how this is happening in this context. The intersectionality of all these is very, very important. And how we go about, I think that's the most pertinent question.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, my question about solidarity is a very hopeful one, and maybe it's a hope that isn't justified because, I've seen myself how a lot of upper caste Indian immigrants will come over to the US, and in India, they will have racist attitudes when they are here. They experience what it is like for the first time to be seen as a person of color. So they might concede something to anti-racism and take on anti-racist attitudes, but they still maintain casteist distinctions, right? So there's a very interesting and complicated way in which solidarity does or does not happen in a way that suggests, unfortunately, that rationality isn't part of it, because these various oppressions share certain logics. So if you find yourself to be against one, rationally, logically, you should find yourself to be against the others. But in practice, that is not how it plays out at all.
But I would challenge that. I think it is. I think people are making rational choices. I think from my experience in England, people are very meticulous about what benefits them. Therefore, they align themselves in certain groups. So it is not irrational. So that's what I look at. I think caste provides people meaning and purpose. Therefore, they are able to make the choice to use it for their own purposes. And the problem for many of the people who are excluded from that system is that they do not have a choice.
Right.
But people who belong to the higher categories have a choice. So I think there needs to be a much better conversation between people who are outside the system and people who are enlightened enough to sacrifice their own positions. And I think that applies to the issue that you raised. I think the white liberal progressive is that there's the concept of white fragility. I think you don't want to give up your privileged position. If you want to engage in a constructive proposal for a society, you should be willing to sacrifice your own privileged position. And that is the problem with caste groups, that they don't, because in Indian system, because of the political establishment, you have the reservation system, where different caste groups are provided quota system in order to facilitate some kind of progress. That itself, which was invented to create a parity, actually has become a perpetuating source to entrench discriminatory practice. Because I think there needs to be somewhere someone has to give up in order to create a better...
I just want to mention, could you hear me without? I just want to... Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Is it, okay. It's working? Okay. I just want to mention you mentioned when Indian immigrants arrived here in the United States and the complicatedness of it, that they didn't see themselves. There's a whole major discussion among Caribbean and Latin American scholars also, because you mentioned this, how the ideologies of race were spread through all the colonial enterprises. And in Latin America, people are not even aware of this here in the United States. There are more people of African descent in Latin America than there are in the United States, at like 150 million. In fact, Brazil is the second largest black country in the world. But people, some people don't realize, I mean, there's racism, internalized racism that has been co-opted in Latin America. So people look at black people as inferior, but they arrive to this country and realize that this is the way I put it, everyone here who's not European American is a Negro. And I don't mean Negro in a negative sense, but is black. Whether people want to realize it or not, whether people want to act like they're not, that's what you basically are. And what I mean by that, that's how you're going to be treated in a horrible way. So it's interesting, the connections that are there. I mean, in Latin America, they go as far as in the Dominican Republic, everyone was declared an Indian, indigenous Indian. Peter Wade, one of the foremost scholars on the issue of ethnicity and culture in Latin America, states that in Colombia, there are more Taino Indians now than when Christopher Columbus got there. And what he means by that is that everybody wants to declare themselves Indian rather than black. I would disagree with you a little bit in the rationality or irrationality of actors. I tend to believe that people respond not so much by rationality, but by the options that are available to them. So if the option is to go one way, doesn't mean people think the things through carefully. They just accept what's the easiest path.
I think both of you are talking more in terms of instrumental rationality, and I was talking more about the lack of logic involved in seeing something as being hypocritical and still refusing to recognize it as hypocritical. So slightly different definitions there. But I have another question for both of you, and then I think we should open it up to the audience. Since both of you are invested in theology, I was hoping you could say a little bit about again, I turn to hope, the more hopeful situation of finding emancipatory kinds of theology from within the church. I mean, you do what you do for a reason. So why do you do what you do? And I'm thinking here of Ambedkar, who said that I need to find a religion that my Dalit peers can turn to as a way of realizing liberation for themselves, within themselves. And Christianity cannot be it, because it's too invested in imperialism. What you said about the evil, for instance, in Christianity. But we can't stop there, obviously, right? So can you talk a little bit about what you might tell your own parishioners, or your, about theological models that you find to be emancipatory, or how you handle, what is it for you? What is the Anglican Church for you? What is Christianity for you? What is your religious tradition for you? And why, as people of color from backgrounds that have been painful and divided, do you still turn to that?
I think the quick answer would be I will ask you to read my book, and I will give my book.
I'd love to.
Which is entirely on that issue of how close to 25 million Dalit Christians go through their Christian faith in their own terms, which many of the institutional church cannot recognize as official Christianity. Because the way that they have been able to utilize Christian faith that makes sense to them in their own struggles, everyday struggles, is very different from the institutional Christianity. And that's what gives me hope, in a sense, that these people, most of Dalit Christians, because that's my primary area of research, is that they embraced Christianity before Ambedkar in the hope that this promise from the missionaries that they are going to be liberated from their social existence and social discriminated state continue to live in the same state, because of the reasons that I cited, that caste itself was incorporated within the church. So the church replicates the same caste system within itself. So you end up with a hope that you come and become Christian, you end up in the same place, but in a different location. But what I found spending time with lots of rural communities of Dalit Christians is that they are not bothered about that. They are bothered about how I can make my faith in Jesus Christ, my faith in a God, can give me strength to carry on and transform my own life wherever I am. And that is fascinating because they were able to use all those that they can access in terms of little expressions of dissent, little expressions of revolt within a village economy, little expressions of just going away from the village, moving away from the village and jumping into a whole urban economy. They find resource from the scripture, from their faith. Interestingly, the same faith that has been given to them by the colonial missionaries. Very interestingly, they also draw from their own traditional understanding of religion and practice, which kind of combined with Christian faith becomes a very exciting opportunity for them to articulate a traditional practice that they have been told not to do by the Christian missionaries. Now they are actually accessing those resources along with Christian faith to find a new way forward. And that's been the experience. And I explain that in detailed anthropological research. It's fascinating, and that's what gives me hope to look forward. And if only we recognize and foster that kind of creative imagination within a location of complete hopelessness, I think we have hope to move forward.
I think that's something that I deal with constantly, trying to reinterpret the Christian message in its more original form, and if not more original form, in just a way that's liberative for communities, oppressed communities. But I would say several things. One is that marginalized people, for lack of a better word, are not ignorant, and they're not passive. So they've been constantly reinterpreting the message in a more liberationist way, whether we want to acknowledge it or not. In fact, I think interreligious engagement scholars would do well to speak to people of color, because we've been doing that for a long time. We call it multiple religious affiliations, at least in the Latin American context. Right. You go to church in the morning, go see the Santero priest in the afternoon, and a spiritist at 9 o'clock at night, or you have it incorporated into your theology. But let me just give you one example that I found doing research in New York. I went to an Arab Lutheran church. Within the Lutheran tradition and many traditions, you read an Old Testament scripture, a psalm, a gospel, and a New Testament scripture lesson on Sundays. So the pastor there, who was Palestinian, said, we don't read the Old Testament piece here. So I said, why not? He said, it bashes people from the Middle East, like us all. You know, a lot of the stuff, it's horrible what it says about Palestinian, Egyptian people. So they just kept it out. They threw it out. They have no use for it. So people know what to do quite often without saying it. The thing is, they won't say that they're doing this because there's no need to say it. They just move on. Right. The problem is when you have theological institutions that are still permeated with white supremacist ideas, and people of color go there, they go back to their churches and they can't function to some extent, because they have a message that is foreign and oppressive, whether they realize it or not. One last example. There's this new way of thinking. It's not that new, but I mean, it's really emphasized where, and I agree with part of it, that violence shouldn't be looked at as redemptive. So a lot of feminist theologians and progressive theologians don't want to speak about the cross, in a sense. But when people who are oppressed look at the cross, they're not necessarily looking at the cross as if violence is necessary for liberation. What they're seeing is that apparently without violence, you don't get liberation, because all our heroes and heroines have been assassinated. People who try to seek liberation like Jesus have been assassinated. So they try to enforce or impose a theology that's coming at a Euro-American ideology, which is really lost. So the church, if anything, needs to go to marginalized communities and really learn some theology that's contextual. So there is hope because the people have been doing it all along. You can see that in the African American church here in the United States and Latin America and in urban centers. I always say how people do theology, not how they practice it. You go interview people in New York City and they do theology according to their context, even when they're not totally doing it consciously.
Thank you.
Let's open up the conversation. Questions? Yes.
I was very interested when you were talking about in India, the caste system came from the Dutch. Is that right? Portuguese. And I was thinking that in India, it's a very, I think the word is homogenous in terms of race, like everyone looks very similar. And that the Portuguese took a system that said, okay, well, we can't do it based on race and appearance, then we'll do it by occupation, primarily. And I was thinking about different cultures in the world and how, like, in other words, in the United States, racism is easy because we have so many groups who look very different. But in India, they couldn't use racism like we do it here, so they had to use it by occupation. And even in the Middle East, they have the different forms of Islam. And so I was thinking, if you think of human history, it just seems like there's always some, like a tribal instinct trying to push a group down or push groups down. And I was just wondering if any of you could speak to that. That, I mean, even like in the United States, if you know Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, like how it mutates over time. Like, so we don't have segregation anymore, but we still have segregation. So we don't have like official legal codes, but it mutated, so now we still have segregation. So I know it's a kind of a big question, but I was very interested, like, just going back to India, you know, so their segregation was based on occupation. It wasn't based on how people appear.
Yeah, just to clarify that point, I think there were two broad categorizations that predates the Portuguese colonial period, which is the Varna system. Varna system is literally means color. So it's color-coded on the basis of skin. So people of my color would be the lowest because my skin is the darkest. And so the higher...
So you even had color as...
Yeah.
Okay.
And linked to that was also occupation. For instance, those who dealt, and as I showed that image, like if your matters are mostly related with your intellect, then you are higher and superior. So the Kshatriyas were the kind of strong people, so they are the warriors and kings, and those who were from the, because this all goes back to the myth that was part of the Vedic literature, that the original Purusha, the original human being who sacrificed himself, and different groups of people came from different parts of the body. And so the Dalits or the untouchables were left out of the system because they are not good enough to be even included in the system. But what happened was that when they put all these different classifications, the Portuguese brought all these different classifications under one banner and called it caste. Caste itself was based on purity and pollution. So what happened was that this kind of massive amalgamation of multiple ways of identification and social markers were collapsed into one particular category. And that is why caste today, 400 years fast forward, is able to survive because it means different things to different people. But it still is a very potent way of being categorized. So, but this is what it plays into, that human tendency to subjugate someone below you. And this, I write in my work that even within Dalit communities, the untouchable outcast community, there are more than 500 different categorizations. So there are intra-Dalit conflict.
Please excuse my ignorance, or maybe this is a naive question, but so in India there are efforts toward equality in things like government benefits, but they rely on categories like forward caste and backward caste. And I wonder, is there something in the identification, specific identification of caste itself that subverts efforts towards mitigating socioeconomic disparity, opportunity disparity? And if there isn't, is there something in the secular approaches toward reduction in caste discrimination that churches might adopt or adapt to help with?
Yeah, quickly, I think, again, this classification was a kind of colonial product where they were trying to organize how to help groups of people who were left behind in the system to be pushed forward. And so that was adapted by the early Indian governments to classify different categories. So what happened is that in India, even today, you need to have a birth certificate that states which caste you belong to, even today. And when you apply for anything, right from a small job to getting any loan or anything, you need to specify your caste category. And that's how it all works. But the alternative, I think, what I would go back to Ambedkar and what he tried to do is his slogan was educate, organize, and agitate. So what he said is that education is a key component of any change. Religion itself by itself cannot provide emancipation. So education and enlightenment within the secular frame of reference would be the only way forward, in a sense that if all people are educated and are able to be in a recent rational conversation, we should be able to overcome all these differences. But the problem is that when you magnify it to 1 billion people, it's a very complicated situation. And also because what has happened now is that because of the kind of competition, almost like to resources, caste competition has become entrenched. Therefore, even within the outcast communities, they are all quite conscious about their own caste system so that they can receive whatever benefit they can get.
Could I, Anderson, get you to talk a little bit more about things that were in both Sam's and Mukti's presentations, although slightly differently. I think they were both pushing you a little bit on the kind of structural piece of your analysis, and Mukti coming from a couple of literary examples where caste-based thinking turns out to be bad for everyone. So I wonder if so that's a kind of irrationality, if you will, right? Attachment to a certain kind of way of thinking and structure, social structure, that maybe in the short term seems to benefit certain people, but at the end of the day is going to take everybody down. And then Sam talking in a related, though different way, I think, about kind of practices of theology, like what people do, and you might pick a piece of the tradition and just set it aside, or you might emphasize a piece of the tradition a little bit more. And that, too, is a kind of irrationality, if you will. And it doesn't follow a kind of institutional logic anyway, whereas your presentation is mostly focused on kind of institutional logic. So I just wanted to kind of raise that as a little bit of a tension here and get you to talk about it, but then also Sam and Mukti.
Yeah, no, that's where I look to. I think it's very important that the reason that I'm going down the kind of post-colonial experience is that it's very important to dismantle the infrastructure and the scaffolding upon which these institutions still sit and continue to perpetuate the same kind of myths that has been perpetuated. So for me, I think what is liberating, what is hopeful within Indian context for Dalit Christians is that, for instance, my parents, of course, I was telling this yesterday that I come from a community called the Paraya community, which is an English expression, social outcast that is used, but that is a caste identity. But mostly they're dealt with kind of dead animals and carcasses, and their job is drumming. So the drum becomes their essential identity. So drums and Dalits are central identity. So when they were converted to Christianity, the first thing they were told not to use is drums. And so when I came to study in Scotland and I chose my research topic, and when I went back home and then I asked a friend of mine to make a drum for me to reclaim my identity, and my mom wouldn't allow me inside the house because she said that identity is done, so we have given it up. So we don't want that. We are Christians. We are beyond all that. I think, in a way, for her, having grown up in a very, very difficult situation, the only way that can be emancipatory is to forget about that identity. So for me, I think the important thing is that the church, particularly from a Christian experience, should abandon its kind of institutional inhibitions to actually embrace the experience of people, to bring not the church kind of waiting for people to come to them, but actually where they are, that's where the church is. So there is this kind of reorientation of what church itself means for Christians is crucial. If that doesn't happen, I don't think there is any future for Christianity in India, because the most important thing is that you need to abandon that kind of institutional colonial framing where we are still stuck in that reference point. And for me, I think it's critical, unless we want to take that risk, the church and Christianity can kind of simply say goodbye as far as... And the same thing applies to Church of England. And the reason that hordes of people are leaving the church is that they are not speaking the language of the people, both the minorities and young people who are inspired by the secular lifestyle. So that's the problem with all institutional churches, and I would advocate that they need to abandon that. But do you think that is a possibility, that we need to think beyond the boundaries of what we traditionally hold?
I think so, and I think it happens already. I published a book which was my dissertation, Mask Africanisms and Puerto Rican Pentecostalism. And one of the things that I argue is that in the Caribbean, Pentecostalism has been well accepted. One of the reasons, among many perhaps, is that people could do religiosity and spirituality in a much more African way and still claim to be Christian in a country where you're supposed to be Christian. So people could speak in tongues, dance in the spirit, and do all sorts of things that when white, although they're white Pentecostals, but when white Christians go into some of our black churches or brown churches, they're like surprised to see what they find there. But we are constantly redefining. People are not passive. We take something that we have to deal with and work it into something else quite often. So although mainline Christianity has failed in Latin America and the Caribbean, Pentecostal-type churches have grown really greatly. So people are constantly doing that. Even in the Pentecostal church, using the congas, drums, was not acceptable 50 years ago. Now it's a different story.
Nate, we'll make that the last question, and then we'll have lunch.
Sure.
Right.
So a lot of these have to do with sort of what is the infrastructure of indoctrination. And so if you think about in the Christian tradition, even around literacy, institution building, church building, there's catechesis, right? The catechism as like the method of indoctrination in a lot of the colonial spaces. I think what's really interesting about Sam's comment is that even sort of pluralism or interreligious dialogue can form its own sort of infrastructure of indoctrination as well. And so then the question that I have is, if there's a certain amount of portability, how then does that shape then a pedagogical shift? And maybe the novel is a sort of engagement that doesn't fit always, or the sort of varieties of human experience. And so just as we think about this conversation and the portability of different modes of oppression, then how do we teach and think differently?
I think the quick response to that would be, I think, just what is happening here. I think to have a kind of cross-fertilization of knowledge and also build solidarity and allies from different backgrounds who are committed to that kind of transformation and emancipation that we are looking to, and then provide that as a resource for institutions to actually look at the importance of that back in their own institutions. One quick example is that what I'm trying with Church of England, for instance, is that for a long time, Church of England did not actually study the mission history. Students in Church of England theological seminaries could go on to become vicars and priests without knowing the mission history of their own church, particularly how they were doing outside England. And that needs to change because they are not having an idea how they are part of a wider church. It's all about a closed mindset. And I think this kind of collective understanding and challenging and bringing together and synergy of knowledge and energy is critical to challenge any such processes. I think independent groups could not achieve, in my opinion, such a vast change of mindset.
Nate, can I just ask you to clarify what you meant by portabilities of oppression? The portability of oppressions?
The sort of frameworks, the infrastructures of Christianity that do the indoctrination across which caste and race are mapping, that Christianity is not unique in terms of its usefulness for mapping across social and racial and caste categories. And so, to sort of what Sam's point was, I think that even kind of like a sort of pluralistic, interreligious frame also can become an infrastructure that reinforces those hierarchies and inequalities. So then that's sort of what I was getting at.
Yes, okay. That makes sense. I was just thinking about the novel because of something you said in the middle of your question, which is you don't know how relevant the novel is. And it's so interesting because just this morning I was talking to my class about a Zadie Smith piece that recently came out in the New York Review of Books called Fascinated to Presume, in which she talks about, according to her, literature having this unique capacity to build empathy for people who inhabit situations, racial, sexual, caste, class, that you yourself have never, ever inhabited yourself. And the reason she says that literature can do this is because it is able to map out and almost perform a vast range of recognizable human emotions that can then be transferred to similar but not the same sorts of oppressions. And that in reading particular situations which you might never have to undergo yourself, whether because you're coming from a position of privilege or because you've never actually had to undergo any specific sort of oppression of that type, you are still able to understand what that might feel like because in some sense the experiences of various characters map onto some sort of cognate or comparable emotion that you yourself have experienced in a different situation in your life. So I'm wondering if novels can...
Different kind of catechism.
Can work as a different kind of way of approaching this issue. And that's just a thought I throw out there because I'm from a literature department, and here I am discussing.
This is what we do. Yeah, sure. Yeah. I think we should thank our speakers very much. So, thank you.